The gavel didn't just bang. It sounded like a gunshot sealing a coffin. Judge Harrison Jonathan wasn't looking at the facts. He was looking at skin color and a conviction rate he desperately wanted to pad before the election. 18-year-old Joseph stood alone, trembling in an orange jumpsuit that hung off her frame, watching as the system designed to protect her began to swallow her whole. They thought she was just another statistic, another voiceless kid from the wrong side of the tracks. But Judge Jonathan made one fatal calculation error. He didn't check the last name on the docket carefully enough. He was busy framing the daughter of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the United States. And when those courtroom doors swing open, the hunter is about to become the hunted. The air in courtroom 4B smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent that 17-year-old Joseph Washington would forever associate with fear. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating, low-frequency hum, like a trapped fly that wouldn't die. Joseph sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned the color of ash. She was wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit provided by the county jail, the fabric scratchy and smelling faintly of industrial detergent. It was a stark contrast to the crisp navy blazer and pleated skirt she had been wearing when the officers pulled her over 3 days ago. "Sit up straight," her public defender, a harried woman named Sarah Jenkins, whispered. Sarah looked exhausted. She was drowning in a sea of case files, and Joseph was just another ripple in the water. Judge Jonathan hates it when defendants slouch. It's a respect thing. "I didn't do it," Joseph whispered back, her voice barely a tremor. "I told you. The bag wasn't mine. It was under the passenger seat of the rental. I've never seen it before." Sarah sighed, shuffling papers without looking up. "Look, Joseph, I believe you. But the police report says they found 2 ounces of methamphetamine and a scale in a car you were driving. In this county, with this judge, that's possession with intent to distribute. Mandatory minimums are ugly. If you take the plea, I'm not taking a plea for something I didn't do." Joseph's voice rose slightly, causing the bailiff near the door to rest his hand on his belt. "Quiet," Sarah hissed. "He's coming." The side door swung open, and the bailiff bellowed, "All rise!" Judge Harrison Jonathan swept into the room like a dark cloud. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair slicked back severely, and a face etched with lines of perpetual disapproval. He didn't walk. He marched. He was a man who believed the law was a hammer and everyone before him was a nail. He was currently polling 10 points ahead in the upcoming district election, running on a zero-tolerance platform that had devastated half the families in the precinct. Jonathan took his seat, the leather chair groaning under his weight. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at the docket, then at Joseph. His eyes were cold, devoid of curiosity. He didn't see a terrified honors student on her way to a college tour. He saw a quota. "Case number 492F4, Jonathan barked, his voice gravelly. "State versus Washington. Possession with intent to distribute. Class B felony. Let's get this moving. I have a tea time at 3, and I intend to make it." The prosecutor, District Attorney Clifford Baines, stood up. Baines was younger, ambitious, and mirrored the judge's arrogance. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and smirked. "Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor." "Defense?" Jonathan asked, barely looking at Sarah. "Ready, Your Honor," Sarah said, standing up. "However, the defense would like to renew our motion to suppress the evidence found in the vehicle. The traffic stop was conducted without probable cause. My client was driving 3 miles under the limit, signaled her turn and—" "Denied," Jonathan interrupted, waving a hand dismissively, as if swatting away a gnat. "Officer Reynolds stated he observed erratic driving. That's probable cause in my court." Sit down, Miss Jenkins. But, Your Honor, the dash cam footage was conveniently corrupted during the upload, Sarah argued, her voice trembling slightly. We have no proof of this erratic driving other than the officer's word. Jonathan leaned forward, peering over his glasses. The room went silent. Are you questioning the integrity of the Oak Creek Police Department in my courtroom, Counselor? I am questioning the lack of evidence, Your Honor. Motion denied, Jonathan repeated, louder this time. Call your first witness, Mr. Baines. Let's wrap this up. Joseph felt a cold pit open in her stomach. It wasn't just that they didn't believe her. It was that they didn't care. She looked toward the back of the courtroom. It was empty. She had tried to call her father for 3 days. Her one phone call at the precinct had gone to voicemail, and the correctional officers had laughed when she asked for another. Daddy is busy, Princess, one had sneered. Probably doesn't want to talk to a junkie anyway. She knew her dad was in high-level meetings in D.C. He often went dark for days during sensitive negotiations. He didn't even know she was in this state. She had taken a spontaneous road trip to visit a university campus, a surprise trip she hadn't cleared with him because she wanted to feel independent. Stupid, she thought, fighting back tears. So stupid. The trial, if you could call it that, moved with the speed of a predetermined execution. D.A. Baines called Officer Reynolds to the stand. Reynolds was a bulky man with a buzz cut and a neck that spilled over his collar. He chewed gum while he testified, a violation of protocol that Judge Jonathan seemed to conveniently ignore. Tell the court what happened on the night of November 14th, Baines said, leaning against the jury box, playing to the audience of 12 who looked bored and tired. I was on patrol on I-95, Reynolds droned. Saw the defendant's vehicle, a grey sedan, swerving across the lane dividers. I initiated a stop. Upon approaching the vehicle, I smelled a strong odor of marijuana, which gave me probable cause to search. I found the baggie of meth under the seat. Joseph gasped. I don't smoke. There was no smell, she whispered frantically to Sarah. Sarah stood up. Objection. There was no marijuana found in the car, only the alleged methamphetamine. If the officer smelled marijuana, why was none recovered? Judge Jonathan slammed his gavel. Overruled. The odor could have been residual. The officer is an expert. Stop wasting the court's time, Ms. Jenkins. But, Your Honor, one more interruption, and I will hold you in contempt, Jonathan threatened. His eyes bored into Sarah, daring her to speak. She sat down, defeated. Reynolds continued, painting a picture of Joseph as belligerent, nervous, and high. Every word was a lie. Joseph had been polite, terrified, and completely sober. She had offered to take a breathalyzer. She had offered a blood test. They had refused both, claiming the field sobriety test, which they conducted off-camera, was sufficient failure. Cross-examination? Jonathan asked, checking his watch. Sarah stood up, trying to salvage the wreckage. Officer Reynolds, did you run the license plate of the rental car? Yes. And who was the renter listed? It was a corporate rental. Reynolds shrugged. Some company out of D.C. Did you contact the rental company to see who had the car before Ms. Washington? No need. She was driving it. She was in possession. So it's entirely possible, Sarah pressed, her voice gaining a little strength, that the drugs were left there by a previous driver? The car hadn't been cleaned. My client had only been in the vehicle for 2 hours. Objection! Baines shouted. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Jonathan said instantly. The jury will disregard the defense's desperate attempts to shift blame. Joseph's heart hammered against her ribs. Desperate attempts. The judge was practically instructing the jury to convict her. Baines rested his case before lunch. It had taken less than 2 hours. Defense, call your witness, Jonathan ordered. "I call the defendant, Joseph Washington, to the stand," Sarah said. It was a Hail Mary. Usually, you never put the defendant on the stand, but they had nothing else. Joseph had to show them she was a person, not a criminal. Joseph walked to the stand, her legs feeling like lead. She swore on the Bible, her hand shaking. "Joseph," Sarah asked gently, "tell the court about yourself." I'm a senior at Georgetown Day School," Joseph stammered. "I have a 4.0 GPA. I'm captain of the debate team. I was driving to North Carolina to visit Duke University. I've never touched a drug in my life." Judge Jonathan scoffed loud enough for the microphone to pick it up. "Impressive resume. Doesn't mean you aren't dealing on the side to pay for those fancy prep school tuitions." Joseph turned to the judge, shocked. "Your Honor, my father pays for my tuition. We don't need money." "Oh, I'm sure," Jonathan smirked. "And where is this benevolent father? If you're such a golden child, surely he'd be here." "He doesn't know," Joseph said, her voice cracking. "I couldn't reach him. You wouldn't let me call him again." "You got your call," Jonathan snapped. "Not our fault nobody picked up." D.A. Baines stood up for cross-examination. He didn't ask about her grades. He didn't ask about the car. He went for character assassination. "Ms. Washington, isn't it true that you were stopped 3 years ago for shoplifting?" That was a misunderstanding," Joseph cried. "I was 14. I forgot to pay for a lip gloss in my pocket, and the charges were dropped immediately." "So you have a history of theft and dishonesty," Baines concluded, turning to the jury. "No, that's not true." No further questions. Joseph returned to her seat, tears streaming down her face. She felt small. She felt dirty. The system was a machine, and it was grinding her bones to dust. Judge Jonathan leaned back. "Closing arguments. 5 minutes each. I want to be out of here by 3. Sarah pleaded with the jury to look at the lack of evidence, the corrupted video, the logic of a straight-A student trafficking drugs in a rental car. Baines simply pointed at the bag of drugs on the evidence table and said, "She had it. She's guilty. Don't let these criminals fool you with tears." The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. They came back before Joseph could even dry her eyes. "Have you reached a verdict?" Jonathan asked. "We have, Your Honor." The jury foreman, an older man who hadn't looked at Joseph once, stood up. "We find the defendant, Joseph Washington, guilty of possession with intent to distribute." A sob ripped from Joseph's throat. "Excellent," Jonathan said, banging the gavel. "Sentencing immediately. I see no reason to delay." "Your Honor," Sarah shouted, standing up. "Sentencing hearings are usually scheduled weeks out. We need time to prepare character statements to—" "I've heard enough character statements," Jonathan sneered. "She's a liar and a drug dealer, and I am going to make an example out of her. In this county, we do not tolerate poison on our streets." He looked at Joseph, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Joseph Washington, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary, without the possibility of parole for the first 10. Perhaps in prison, you'll learn some respect for the law." "15 years?" Joseph screamed, standing up. The bailiff grabbed her arm roughly. "No, you can't. My dad, please, I need to call my dad." "Your daddy can't save you now," Jonathan laughed darkly. "Take her away." Just as the bailiff began to drag Joseph toward the side door, leading to the holding cells, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with a force that shook the walls. The silence that followed the crashing of the doors was absolute. It wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum, sucking the arrogance right out of the room. Standing in the doorway wasn't just a man, it was a wall of men. 6 individuals dressed in sharp, tactical suits, wearing earpieces and bearing the distinct, terrifying posture of federal agents who were not here to negotiate. On their chests, bold yellow letters on navy windbreakers spelled out 3 letters that made the blood run cold in any corrupt official's veins: FBI. But they parted like the Red Sea for the man walking in behind them. He was tall, over 6'3", wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than the bailiff made in a year. His tie was a deep power red. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator drone acquiring a target. It was Thomas Wright. Joseph, halfway to the holding cell door with the bailiff's hand still clamped on her arm, felt her knees buckle. "Daddy!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the tension. The bailiff, acting on instinct and the judge's previous orders, yanked her back. "Quiet, prisoner. Take your hands off her," Thomas Wright's voice boomed. It didn't need a microphone. It was a baritone rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "If you do not release her arm in the next 2 seconds, you will be facing a federal assault charge that will bury you under the jail." The bailiff froze, looking from the imposing stranger to Judge Jonathan. Jonathan, recovering from his initial shock, slammed his gavel down, his face turning a shade of angry crimson. "Order! Order in my court! Who do you think you are, bursting into my courtroom like this? Bailiff, arrest this man for contempt of court and obstruction of justice." The 2 deputies near the front of the room reached for their tasers, stepping toward Thomas. Before they could take 2 steps, 4 of the federal agents had their weapons drawn, not pointed, but at the low ready, fingers indexed. The click of safeties disengaging echoed like thunderclaps. "Federal agents!" the lead agent barked. "Stand down, hands where we can see them." Judge Jonathan stood up, trembling with rage. "This is a state courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. I am the supreme authority in this room." Thomas Wright walked down the center aisle. He didn't rush. He walked with the terrifying inevitability of a tidal wave. He stopped at the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court, pushed it open, and stepped inside. He reached into his jacket pocket. D.A. Baines flinched, but Thomas pulled out a leather credentials wallet and flipped it open. The gold badge caught the fluorescent light, blindingly bright. "My name is Thomas Wright," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am the Attorney General of the United States. And as of this moment, this courtroom is a crime scene." Judge Jonathan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He slumped back into his chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the quiet room. The color drained from D.A. Baines's face so fast, he looked like a wax figure. "Attorney General," Jonathan whispered. He looked at Joseph, the girl in the orange jumpsuit he had just sentenced to 15 years, the girl he had mocked, the girl he had called a liar. Joseph was sobbing now, running toward her father. The bailiff, realizing his career, and possibly his freedom, hung in the balance, had released her as if she were made of burning coal. Thomas caught her, wrapping his arms around her. The hardness in his face melted for a split second as he kissed the top of her head. "I've got you, baby girl. I'm here. I'm sorry I was late." He then looked up over her shoulder, locking eyes with Judge Jonathan. The softness vanished. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated destruction. "You sentenced my daughter," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Without due process. You ignored exculpatory evidence, and you did it to boost your polling numbers." "Now, wait just a minute," Jonathan stammered, trying to regain his footing. "I didn't know who she was. The evidence was clear. Drugs were found in her car." "The car," Thomas said, releasing Joseph and stepping toward the bench, "was a government-issued transport vehicle, registered to the Department of Justice. It was on loan to my family for a secure transport. Did you bother to check the VIN number, Judge? Or were you too busy rushing to your tea time? Jonathan swallowed hard. It was a rental. The officer said. The officer lied, Thomas said. He turned to the back of the room. Agent Miller, bring it in. Agent Miller, a woman with sharp features and a tablet in her hand, marched forward. She plugged a cable into the court's presentation system, hijacking the screens that had been blank during the trial. Your Honor, or should I say, Mr. Jonathan, Thomas began, pacing the floor like a tiger. You relied on the testimony of Officer Reynolds, who claimed the dashcam footage was corrupted, a convenient technical glitch that seems to happen in 40% of the arrests made by this precinct involving minority defendants. On the screens, a video file appeared. It was crystal clear, high definition. But you see, Thomas continued, that car is equipped with a tertiary satellite uplink. It doesn't store data on a local hard drive that can be corrupted by a magnet or a spilled coffee. It uploads directly to the DOJ servers in Quantico, real-time, encrypted, permanent. Thomas pointed a remote at the screen. Play. The video played. It showed Joseph driving perfectly straight. She was singing along to the radio. There was no swerving, no erratic behavior. Then, the lights flashed behind her. She pulled over immediately, using her signal. The audio crackled to life. Officer Reynolds, voiceover. License and registration. Joseph. Here you go, officer. Was I speeding? Reynolds. Get out of the car. Joseph. Why? What did I do? Reynolds. I said get out. I smell weed. Pause, Thomas commanded. The video froze. We pulled the telemetry data from the car's internal sensors, Thomas said, holding up a thick stack of papers. The atmospheric sensors inside the cabin detected 0 particulate matter consistent with cannabis smoke. In fact, the air quality was cleaner than the air outside on this highway. Play. The video continued. Joseph was pulled out, terrified. Reynolds handcuffed her and put her in the back of his cruiser. Then, the camera angle shifted. It was a side view from the car's 360-degree security system, a camera Reynolds didn't know existed. On screen, Officer Reynolds leaned into his own patrol car, reached into a duffel bag in the passenger seat, and pulled out a plastic baggie filled with white crystals. He then walked back to Joseph's car, opened the driver's side door, and slid the baggie under the seat. The entire courtroom gasped. It was undeniable. It was high-definition proof of planting evidence. Officer Reynolds, who was sitting in the front row, stood up, his face pale. He bolted for the side exit. Don't even think about it, an FBI agent standing by the door said, leveling a taser at his chest. Reynolds froze, raising his hands. Thomas turned back to Jonathan. The judge was shaking. He looked like a man watching his house burn down with him inside. Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 242, Thomas recited from memory, his voice echoing off the walls. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime, punishable by life in prison if the acts result in kidnapping or an attempt to kill. And make no mistake, throwing an innocent 18-year-old girl into a maximum security prison is an attempt on her life. Mr. Attorney General, Jonathan croaked, sweat dripping down his temple. I had no idea. I was misled by the officer. I am a victim here too. I rely on the police, to be honest. Do you? Thomas asked, stepping up to the judge's bench, invading his personal space. Or do you rely on them to feed the pipeline? Because my team didn't just pull the footage for Joseph's case. While we were flying here, we ran a pattern analysis on your last 500 cases. Thomas signaled Agent Miller again. The screen changed. It was a spreadsheet, rows and rows of names, all minority defendants, all represented by overworked public defenders, all convicted on the testimony of Officer Reynolds and 2 other deputies. "You have a 98% conviction rate," Thomas said, disgust dripping from every word. "Statistically impossible in a fair system. You're not a judge, Jonathan. You're a butcher, and you've been selling the meat to the private prison industry." D.A. Baines stood up, trying to distance himself. I would like to state for the record that the prosecution was unaware of the fabrication of evidence. We move to dismiss all charges immediately." Thomas turned his head slowly to look at Baines. The look was withering. "Sit down, Clifford. You're not negotiating a plea deal here. You prosecuted a case with 0 physical evidence, ignored the defense's motion for discovery, and mocked a child on the stand. You're done." The drama wasn't over. Thomas Wright wasn't just here to free his daughter. He was here to burn the corruption out by the roots. "I am declaring this a federal crime scene," Thomas announced to the room. "No one leaves. Marshals, secure the exits." He turned back to Judge Jonathan. "Harrison Jonathan, please, stand up." Jonathan remained seated, gripping the armrests. You can't arrest a sitting judge in his own courtroom. I have immunity." "Judicial immunity protects you from civil lawsuits for your rulings," Thomas said, his voice deadly sharp. "It does not protect you from criminal prosecution for racketeering, conspiracy to distribute false evidence, and deprivation of civil rights. You crossed the line from incompetence to criminal enterprise a long time ago." Thomas nodded to 2 agents. They walked up the steps to the bench. "Harrison Jonathan," one agent said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." "This is an outrage," Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking. "I am a pillar of this community. I know the governor." "The governor," Thomas interjected calmly, "is currently on the phone with my deputy regarding the federal funding for this state's Judicial Oversight Committee. I don't think he's going to be taking your calls today." Slowly, painfully, Jonathan stood up. The robe, once a symbol of his absolute power, now looked like a costume. He turned around, and the click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room, a sound he had inflicted on thousands of others, now claiming him. The agents marched him down the steps. As he passed the defense table, he looked at Joseph. She was no longer the scared victim. She was standing tall next to her father, her eyes dry, watching justice happen in real time. "And you," Thomas said, pointing a finger at Officer Reynolds, who was being handcuffed by another agent. "You're going to Leavenworth, and once you get there, I'm sure the inmates will be very interested to hear that you're the dirty cop who framed half of them." Reynolds began to cry. Actual tears. The tough guy act evaporated the moment the consequences became real. "Daddy," Joseph whispered, tugging on Thomas's sleeve. "What about Sarah?" Thomas looked at the public defender, Sarah Jenkins. She was still standing behind the table, clutching her files, looking like she had just survived a hurricane. Thomas walked over to her. He extended a hand. "Ms. Jenkins, I reviewed the transcripts of the trial on my way here. You fought hard. You made the right objections. You tried to stop this train wreck despite being completely outgunned and abused by the bench." Sarah shook his hand, her grip trembling. I tried, sir. I'm just sorry I couldn't stop it." "You did your job," Thomas said warmly. "The system failed, not you. And frankly, the Department of Justice needs people who actually care about the law. Here." He pulled a business card from his pocket, heavy stock, embossed with the DOJ seal, and handed it to her. "Call this number on Monday. I have a vacancy in the Civil Rights Division in D.C. It pays double what you make here, and you'll never have to bow down to a tyrant like Jonathan again." Sarah stared at the card, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me," Thomas said, looking at his daughter. "Thank Joseph. She told me you were the only one who listened." Suddenly, the side door banged open again. But this time, it wasn't police. It was the press. Word had leaked. The sight of federal SUVs outside the courthouse had drawn the local news crews like sharks to chum. "Mr. Attorney General," a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward the railing. "Is it true that Judge Jonathan has been arrested? Is it true your daughter was framed?" Thomas turned to the cameras. He straightened his tie. He put a protective arm around Joseph. "Turn the cameras on," Thomas said. "I have a statement to make." He waited for the red lights on the cameras to blink on. "For too long," Thomas began, his voice projecting to the back of the room and through the lens to millions watching at home. "Places like this have operated in the shadows. They have treated the Constitution like a suggestion and human beings like cargo. They thought that because they were in a small town, no one was watching. They thought that because their victims were poor or black or marginalized, no one would care." He looked directly into the camera lens. "But today they made a mistake. They picked the wrong girl, and in doing so, they exposed their own rot. Let this be a warning to every corrupt official, every dirty cop, and every judge who thinks they are above the law. We are watching. The Department of Justice is open for business, and we are coming for you." The footage of the United States Attorney General storming a county courtroom didn't just make the nightly news. It became a digital wildfire that scorched the internet. Within 4 hours of the raid, the hashtag #JudgeJonathan was trending worldwide. By the next morning, the clip of Thomas Wright staring down the corrupt judge had been viewed over 50 million times. But for Joseph, the world had shrunk to the back seat of a black government-issue SUV, speeding away from the town that had almost swallowed her whole. She wasn't sent to a prison cell. She was sent to a media storm. 3 days after the raid, Joseph sat on the plush beige couch of the morning show in New York City. The studio lights were blinding, hot against her skin, a stark contrast to the cold, fluorescent hum of Courtroom 4B. She wore a soft cream sweater and jeans, looking every bit the high school honor student she was, but her eyes held a new, haunted depth. Thomas sat next to her, his posture rigid, his hand resting protectively over hers. "I was just driving," Joseph told the host, her voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength as she spoke into the camera. "I was listening to a podcast. I used my turn signal, and suddenly I was in handcuffs. I kept asking what I did, and they just laughed. They didn't see a person. They saw a payday." The host, a seasoned journalist known for her toughness, looked visibly moved. "When the judge sentenced you, 15 years, what went through your mind?" Joseph took a deep breath. "I thought about my dad. But then I thought about the girl who was in the holding cell next to me. Her name was Keisha. She didn't have a dad in the Justice Department. She had a public defender with 300 cases and no time. She got 10 years for a pipe found in a car she was a passenger in. If my last name wasn't right, if my father wasn't who he is, I would be Keisha. I would be a number." That clip, Joseph acknowledging her privilege while fighting for those without it, played on a loop across the country. It turned a sensational news story into a movement. While Joseph fought the battle of public opinion, the FBI was dismantling Oak Creek, brick by brick. The cleanup, as the Department of Justice called it, was surgical and ruthless. The quiet county courthouse was turned into a forward operating base for federal investigators. Dozens of agents in windbreakers swarmed the building, seizing everything that wasn't bolted down. Agent Miller, the tech specialist who had exposed the dashcam footage, led the digital forensic team. What they found in the encrypted servers of Judge Jonathan's private office was worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just simple racism. It was an industrialized machine of human trafficking disguised as justice. They found a complex web of shell companies. Jonathan Consulting LLC, its properties, Blue Line Solutions. Thomas Wright personally oversaw the briefing in a temporary command center set up in the town hall. "Walk me through it," Thomas ordered, looking at the flowcharts projected on the wall. "It's a kids for cash scheme, sir," Agent Miller explained, her face grim. But on steroids, Judge Jonathan had a handshake deal with the Oakwood Juvenile Center, a private for-profit detention facility 3 counties over. The state pays Oakwood a daily stipend for every head in a bed. Oakwood was struggling with low occupancy 5 years ago. That's when Jonathan started his zero-tolerance campaign. Miller tapped the screen. Every time Jonathan sentenced a minor to a minimum of 5 years, a consulting fee was wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands held by Jonathan's wife. He was literally selling these kids to keep the prison profitable. He made over $3 million in the last 4 years. Thomas stared at the screen, his jaw tightening until a muscle lipped in his cheek. And the police? Officer Reynolds was the recruiter, Miller continued. The chief of police set quotas based on Oakwood's occupancy needs. If the prison was low on inmates, the chief ordered a crackdown on suspected trafficking. Reynolds and his squad would go out, find out-of-state cars or locals from the minority districts, plant the evidence, and feed the pipeline. Reynolds got a kickback, the chief got his stats up, and Jonathan got his retirement fund. "Burn it down," Thomas said softly. "I want every single person who touched this money in handcuffs by Friday." The dominoes fell with satisfying speed. Officer Reynolds, the bulky bully who had smirked while lying on the stand, didn't last an hour in the interrogation room. Confronted with the bank transfers and the undeniable video evidence, the tough guy facade crumbled. He wept. He begged. And then he sang. He gave up the chief of police. He gave up 2 other deputies who were part of the plant squad. He even gave up the location of the stash house where the police kept the drugs they used for planting. District Attorney Clifford Baines tried to distance himself. He held a press conference claiming he was shocked and appalled by the revelations. It didn't work. The FBI found emails between him and Jonathan discussing which public defenders were too troublesome and needed to be reassigned to traffic court. Baines was disbarred on a Tuesday morning and indicted on obstruction of justice charges by Tuesday afternoon. But the most profound impact of the fallout wasn't the arrests, it was the liberation. Because Jonathan's court was now proven to be a criminal enterprise, the Department of Justice ordered an emergency review of every single conviction handed down by Judge Jonathan in the last decade. A team of 50 pro bono lawyers, flown in from D.C., worked around the clock, reviewing case files. 2 months after the raid, on a crisp Saturday morning, a white bus pulled up to the Oak Creek courthouse. It wasn't bringing prisoners in, it was bringing them home. Joseph and Thomas stood on the steps, watching. The press was there, but they stayed back, respectful of the moment. The bus doors opened. The first person to step off was a young man, maybe 20, looking around as if the sunlight hurt his eyes. A woman in the crowd screamed, a raw, guttural sound of joy, and ran forward, crashing into him. Mother and son collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing. Then came another, and another. 25 people were released that day. 25 lives that had been stolen by Jonathan's greed were returned. Sarah Jenkins, the public defender who had stood alone with Joseph, walked out of the crowd. She looked different. The exhaustion that had grayed her skin was gone. She was wearing a sharp navy suit, and she held herself with the confidence of a woman who had just been appointed as the interim oversight director for the county's public defense office. She walked up to Joseph. "You know," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "I tried to appeal 17 of these cases. Jonathan denied every single one. I thought I was crazy. I thought maybe I was just a bad lawyer." "You were the only good lawyer in the building," Joseph said, smiling. Sarah looked at the reuniting families. "Keisha is on the next bus," she whispered. "The girl you talked about on TV. Her sentence was vacated this morning. She's going home." Joseph felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time since the arrest, the heavy stone in her chest lightened. Thomas put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Ms. Jenkins, the Civil Rights Division in D.C. is still holding that desk for you, but I have a feeling you might be needed here for a while." "I think you're right, General," Sarah nodded, looking at the chaos of joy in the plaza. "Someone has to make sure the new judges don't get too comfortable." The fallout reached its peak with the status of Harrison Jonathan. Denied bail due to the offshore accounts and the massive flight risk, Jonathan was being held in solitary confinement at a federal supermax facility 2 states away. The man who had once treated the county jail as his personal kennel was now living in a 6x8 concrete box. Reports leaked from the prison guards, unofficially, of course. They said Jonathan was not handling it well. He spent his days pacing, muttering about jurisdiction and sovereign immunity. He demanded to speak to the governor daily. The governor, currently fighting for his own political life amidst the scandal, never accepted the calls. Jonathan was alone. The power, the fear, the influence, it had all evaporated, leaving only a small, frightened old man in an orange jumpsuit. One evening, back in their home in D.C., Thomas found Joseph sitting on the back porch, staring at the stars. The media frenzy had quieted down, replaced by the slow, grinding gears of the upcoming trial. "You okay?" Thomas asked, handing her a mug of hot chocolate. "I'm writing my college essay," Joseph said, not looking away from the sky. "Oh, what's the prompt?" "Describe an event that changed your perspective on the world," she recited. Thomas sat down beside her. "That's a heavy topic for a Tuesday." "I used to think the law was like gravity," Joseph said softly. "Something that just existed. Something that was always there, always true. But it's not. It's just people. And people can be broken." "People can be fixed too," Thomas said. "That's why we do the work. That's why we fight." Joseph turned to look at him. "I'm not just going to be a witness at his trial, Dad. I want to be in the room every day. I want him to see me. I want him to know that he didn't win." Thomas smiled, a look of fierce pride in his eyes. "He knows, Joseph. He knows." The stage was set. The investigation was complete. The evidence was mountain high, and the victims were ready to speak. The fallout had cleared the debris, exposing the rot for the world to see. Now, all that was left was the final act, the trial of the century. 6 months had passed since the FBI kicked down the doors of the Oak Creek County Courthouse, but the tremors were still being felt across the entire American judicial system. The snow had melted, giving way to a humid, tense spring in the state capitol, where the federal trial of United States versus Harrison Jonathan was set to conclude. This was no longer the dingy, coffee-stained county courtroom where Jonathan had reigned like a feudal lord. This was the Federal District Court, a cavernous hall of mahogany and marble, where the seal of the United States hung high above the bench like a watchful eye. The air here was different. It was sterile, cold, and heavy with the weight of consequence. Harrison Jonathan sat at the defense table. The transformation was shocking. Gone were the expensive Italian suits, the slicked-back silver hair, and the sneer of absolute authority. In their place sat a man who had aged 20 years in 6 months. His hair was thinning and unkempt, his skin a sallow grey from lack of sunlight. But the most jarring detail was his attire. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, Department of Corrections issue. The very same uniform he had forced terrified teenagers to wear for decades was now his only possession. He was shackled at the ankles, the chains clinking softly against the floor every time he shifted, a sound that seemed to make him flinch. The gallery was packed. It wasn't just reporters this time. It was a sea of faces, parents, grandparents, and exonerated victims. The Jonathan survivors, the media called them. They sat in silent judgment, a living testament to his cruelty. In the front row, Attorney General Thomas Wright sat stoically, his presence a silent reminder of the power that had finally brought the tyrant down. Next to him sat Joseph. She looked older, wiser. The fear that had defined her face 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She held a notebook in her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped a pen. The prosecutor was Assistant U.S. Attorney David Ross, a man known in legal circles as the surgeon for his ability to dissect a defense with cold, brutal precision. Ross stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The evidence screamed for him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ross began, walking slowly toward the box. "Over the last 3 weeks, you have seen the anatomy of a monster. You have seen bank records linking the defendant to offshore accounts in the Caymans, accounts that received deposits every time the juvenile detention center reached capacity. You have seen the emails where he instructed police chiefs to bring me bodies before contract renewal negotiations." Ross paused, pointing a finger at Jonathan. Jonathan didn't look up. He stared at the grain of the wood on the table. "But documents are cold," Ross continued. "The true cost of Harrison Jonathan's greed isn't in a ledger. It's in the empty chairs at dinner tables across this state. It's in the lost years of youth that can never be returned." The prosecution had saved their most devastating weapon for last. They didn't just rely on the paper trail. They called the betrayer. The prosecution calls former officer Gary Reynolds to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reynolds entered from a side door, escorted by marshals. He was already serving his time. He wore a beige federal prisoner uniform. He looked broken, a man who had realized too late that loyalty to a tyrant buys you nothing. Reynolds took the stand. He refused to look at Jonathan. "Mr. Reynolds," Ross asked, "did the defendant ever give you specific instructions regarding traffic stops?" "Yes," Reynolds whispered. "Speak up, please," the judge commanded. "Yes," Reynolds said, his voice cracking. "He told us to target out-of-state plates, rentals, or locals from the south side. He said they were low-hanging fruit. He said if we didn't find anything, we should improvise. He gave us the contact for a supplier who provided the drop bags." The jury looked sick. One juror, an older woman, covered her mouth with her hand. "And why did you listen to him?" Ross asked. Reynolds looked down, tears welling in his eyes. "Because he was the judge. He told us he was the law. He said if we played ball, we'd get promoted. If we didn't, he'd sign warrants for our homes." Jonathan's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, didn't even bother to cross-examine. There was no defending this. Finally, it was time for the victim impact statements before closing arguments. Usually these happen at sentencing, but because this was a federal civil rights trial, the judge allowed testimony regarding the specific trauma inflicted during the conspiracy. The prosecution calls Joseph Washington. Joseph stood up. The room went dead silent. The sound of her footsteps on the marble floor echoed like a heartbeat. She walked to the stand, swore the oath, and sat down. She adjusted the microphone. She looked at the jury, then at her father, who gave her a subtle, strengthening nod. Finally, she turned her head and looked directly at Harrison Jonathan. "Mr. Jonathan," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a clarity that cut through the air. Jonathan slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, hollow. For the first time, he was forced to look at the girl who had brought down his empire. "6 months ago," Joseph began, "you looked at me from a high bench and called me a liar. You called me a criminal. You didn't see my grades. You didn't see my future. You didn't even see a human being. You saw a dollar sign. You saw a bed you needed to fill to get your kickback." She took a breath. "I spent 3 days in your jail before my father found me. In those 3 days, I met girls who had been there for 3 years. Girls who stole a sandwich because they were hungry. Girls who were walking home from school. You took their lives, Mr. Jonathan. You took their graduations, their first jobs, their chances to be mothers, doctors, artists. You stole time. And time is the one thing you can never pay back." Jonathan flinched, his jaw tightening. "My father saved me," Joseph continued, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "But who saved the others? No one. Because you were supposed to be the safety net. You were the person we are taught to trust. You poisoned the very idea of justice in this town. And you did it for money." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm going to college next fall, Mr. Jonathan. I'm going to study constitutional law. And every time I walk into a library, every time I take an exam, every time I live my life, I'm going to remember that you tried to take it from me. And I'm going to use that memory to make sure men like you never sit on a bench again." She stood up. "I don't hate you, Mr. Jonathan. Hate takes energy. And you aren't worth my energy anymore. You're just a cautionary tale." Joseph walked back to her seat. The silence in the room was profound. It felt as if the entire room had been holding its breath. The jury deliberated for less than 45 minutes. It was a formality. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He didn't look at Jonathan. He looked at the judge. "In the matter of the United States versus Harrison Jonathan on the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to deprive civil rights, guilty. On the count of wire fraud, guilty." The guilties kept coming, like hammer blows. 47 counts, 47 convictions. Federal Judge Alastair Kincaid, a stern man with a reputation for absolute fairness, adjusted his glasses. He looked down at Jonathan. "Harrison Jonathan, please stand." Jonathan struggled to his feet, the chains rattling loudly. He looked small, trembling, stripped of all pretense. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Kincaid said, his voice low and disgusted, "I have never seen a more grotesque abuse of power. You did not just break the law, you sold it. You turned this court into a marketplace for human suffering. You preyed on the vulnerable because you thought they had no voice. You were wrong." Kincaid picked up his gavel. He held it suspended in the air for a moment. "There is no mercy for those who show none. Harrison Jonathan, I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate seizure of all assets held by you and your family to be placed in a restitution fund for your victims. You will leave this courtroom with nothing. You will enter prison with nothing. And you will remain there until your last breath." Bang! The gavel strike was final. It was the sound of an era ending. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They didn't handle him gently. They grabbed Jonathan by the arms. For a second, Jonathan looked like he wanted to speak. to beg, to scream. But no sound came out. The reality crushed him. He was no longer the judge. He was inmate 9420. As they dragged him toward the side door, the same door he had sent thousands of children through, he looked back one last time. He saw Joseph. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't cheering. She was simply watching, bearing witness to the inevitable swing of the pendulum. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, sealing him away from the world he had abused. The courtroom erupted. People were hugging, crying, shaking hands. It was a release of years of tension. Thomas Wright stood up and turned to his daughter. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her into a tight embrace. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "No," Joseph said, pulling back and looking at the empty bench where a new, honest judge would soon sit. She wiped a single tear from her cheek and smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. "It's just starting." They walked out of the courthouse together, pushing through the heavy double doors into the blinding afternoon sun. The press cameras flashed, 1,000 shutters clicking at once, capturing the image of the girl who fought the law, and for once, the law won. Joseph's story is a terrifying reminder of how fragile justice can be when power is left unchecked. She was lucky. Her father was the one man who could stop the machine. But for every Joseph, there are thousands of others who don't have a lifeline. Judge Jonathan got what he deserved, serving life in the very cage he built for others. It's the ultimate karma. But it makes you wonder, how many other Jonathans are out there right now? If this story got your blood boiling, hit that like button to take a stand against corruption. Share this video to spread awareness, because the more we watch, the less they can hide. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories where the underdog bites back. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.